Subject of Analysis. Third-T.Ogden. Chapter 6. Projective Identification and the Subjugating Third. A brief executive summary by NoteBook LM. This document synthesizes Third-T.Ogden's psychoanalytic framework for projective identification, presenting it not merely as an intrapsychic defense mechanism but as a profound and complex intersubjective process. At the core of this model is the concept of the subjugating third, a unique form of shared subjectivity created when two individuals engage in projective identification. This third subject emerges from a dynamic of mutual negation, where both the projector and the recipient partially surrender their individual sense of self. The central paradox of this process is that individuals unconsciously subjugate themselves to this shared third entity for the ultimate purpose of freeing themselves from the confines and stagnation of their own isolated subjectivities. This allows for the generation of new thoughts, feelings, and experiences that were previously inaccessible to either person alone. The distinction between a pathogenic and a generative experience of projective identification lies not in the intensity of the process, but in the participant's ability to eventually supersede the subjugating third. This resolution is achieved through an act of mutual recognition, often mediated in a clinical setting by the analyst's interpretation and the analysand's use of it, which allows for the reappropriation of transformed, more fully realized individual subjectivities. 1. The intersubjective nature of projective identification. Third-T.Ogden's analysis reframes projective identification as a fundamental quality of intersubjective experience, moving beyond earlier conceptions to establish it as a complex psychological interpersonal event. From intrapsychic to interpersonal. While the concept originated in the work of Melanie Klein, who implicitly treated it as a psychological interpersonal phenomenon, Ogden builds upon the developments of later theorists, such as Bion, H. Rosenfeld, and others, to explicitly define it through an intersubjective lens. A quality of experience, projective identification is not an isolated event but a quality or dimension of all intersubjectivity. It may at times be the predominant feature of an experience or exist merely as a subtle background coloration. Broad application. The concept is used to describe a wide range of phenomena, from early mother-infant communication and empathic sharing to coercive fantasies and schizophrenic confusional states. Core components of the process. The process involves a combination of unconscious fantasy and concrete interpersonal action, which Ogden views as two facets of a single psychological event. Unconscious fantasy of evacuation. The process is initiated by an unconscious narrative involving the fantasy of evacuating a part of oneself into another person. Dual purpose. This fantasized evacuation serves one of two primary purposes. 1. Protection, to protect oneself from a dangerous or threatening aspect of the self. 2. Safeguarding, to safeguard a valued part of the self by placing it in another person who is experienced as only partially differentiated. Transformation and retrieval. The evacuated part of the self is felt to be altered within the other person. Under optimal conditions, it is retrieved in a less toxic or endangered form. In pathogenic conditions, it may be felt to have become deadened or more persecutory upon its return. Inseparable interpersonal correlates. The interpersonal quality of the event is not a consequence of the fantasy, rather, the unconscious fantasy and the interpersonal event are inextricably linked aspects of the same phenomenon. 2. The concept of the subjugating third. The most distinctive feature of Ogden's framework is the creation of a third subjective entity through the mutual interaction of the projector and recipient. This entity, the subject of projective identification, temporarily subsumes the individual subjectivities of the participants. The mechanics of mutual negation. The creation of this third subject is predicated on a process where both participants engage in a form of self-negation to make psychological space for the new entity. The projector's negation. The projector disavows an aspect of their own I-ness, which is fantasized to be evacuated into the recipient. In doing so, the projector becomes other to himself, experiencing a part of their unconscious being as existing outside the self, simultaneously as I and not I. The recipient's negation. the recipient actively, though unconsciously, participates by subverting their own separate subjectivity. They make psychological room to be occupied by the projector's disavowed aspect, effectively surrendering to the co-opting of their own I-ness. The emergence of a third subject. The outcome of this mutually negating process is the creation of a distinct intersubjective entity that is unique from the two individuals who generated it. A new subjectivity, the subjugating third, is described as a third subject that is both and neither projector and/or recipient. Collapse of dialectical tension. This process involves a partial collapse of the normal dialectical movement between individual subjectivity and intersubjectivity. The individual experiences of the analyst and analysand become powerfully subverted and subsumed within this new analytic third. Asymmetrical subjugation. While mutual, the process in an analytic setting is asymmetrical. Both participants are subjugated by the third they have co-created. 3. The paradox of subjugation and liberation. Ogden posits that projective identification, despite its coercive and limiting qualities, serves a fundamental developmental purpose, to free individuals from the limitations of their own being. Escaping the solipsistic self. The central paradox is that individuals unconsciously subjugate themselves to a shared intersubjective experience in order to achieve a new form of freedom. The paradox: the individuals engaged in this form of relatedness unconsciously subjugate themselves to a mutually generated intersubjective third, for the purpose of freeing themselves from the limits of who they had been to that point. A deep need. This is driven by a human need, as deep as hunger and thirst, to find an exit from the unending, futile wanderings in their own internal object world. Self-analysis alone has severe limitations when isolated from such intersubjective experiences. Generating new experience, the subjugating third becomes a vehicle through which new thoughts, feelings, and sensations can be experienced, possibilities that did not exist for either individual in isolation. The active role of the recipient. The recipient is not a passive vessel but an active, unconscious co-creator in the process, motivated by their own need for psychological growth. Simultaneous projector. There is never a recipient who is not simultaneously a projector. The interplay of subjectivities is never entirely one-sided. Disrupting stagnation. The recipient engages in the subversion of their own individuality for the unconscious purpose of disrupting the closures underlying the coherence/stagnation of the self. Co-authoring fantasy. The experience goes beyond simply playing a role in another's fantasy. Ogden states, one finds oneself unconsciously both playing a role in and serving as author of someone else's unconscious fantasy. 4. Resolution, recognition, and pathology. The ultimate therapeutic value of projective identification depends on the ability of the participants to move beyond a state of subjugation and reclaim their individual subjectivities in a transformed state. The path to psychological growth. For psychological growth to occur, the subjugating third must be superseded, allowing for a new and more generative balance between individuality and interconnectedness. Superseding the third. A successful analytic process involves moving past the collapsed state of the subjugating third. Reappropriation of subjectivity. The participants reappropriate their individual subjectivities, which have been transformed through their experience within the analytic third. A new dialectic. This establishes a new and more generative dialectic of oneness and two-ness, similarity and difference, individual subjectivity and intersubjectivity. The act of mutual recognition. The key mechanism for resolving the subjugation is the act of mutual recognition, which Ogden illuminates using Hegel's master-slave allegory. Hegel's framework. Just as Hegel's subjects require recognition from an other to achieve self-consciousness, the participants in projective identification must be given back to themselves by the other. This giving back is not a return to an original state but the creation of a transformed, more self-reflective subject. Analytic mediation. In the analytic setting, this act of recognition is often mediated by 1. The analyst's accurate and empathic interpretation of the transference-countertransference dynamic. 2. the analysand's capacity to use the analyst's interpretation. Defining pathology. Pathology in projective identification is not determined by the intensity or coercive nature of the unconscious fantasies, e.g., kidnapping, seduction, but by a failure in the process of resolution. Failure of recognition. Pathology is a reflection of the inability/unwillingness of the participants to release one another from the subjugation of the third by means of an act of recognition. Dead unity. When recognition fails, the dialectical process collapses into a dead unity, where individuals relate to each other as static things, rather than participating in a creative interpersonal process. The separateness and interdependence of the individuals are not successfully navigated.